Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether politeness is a vice or a virtue in literature. In a corner, by the fire, are two people. One of them has just gotten back from the big Anselm Society conference, and he refuses to shut up about it. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See. We are a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. Find out more about the programs and the materials we have available. Visit our website at anselmsociety.org. And as you've undoubtedly heard from me over the past, several months, we just had our big conference, Imagination Redeemed, here at Glen Eyrie in Colorado Springs. I'm recording this before I went to the conference, but it's posting after. But I can speak for my future self in saying I expect it's going to be a really fantastic time. If you want to catch up on what the speakers were doing, stay tuned. We'll try to get some of that material to you in some online form before too long. But going back to another theme I talk about a lot, if you want to find out more about us, visit our website, like I said, and also rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Really helps us a ton, increase the visibility of the show, but you know this already. And now, for today's episode, I want to take the listeners back into the past. I want to take you back into the past for law school Matt. He looks a lot like current-day Matt, except he's in slightly better shape and has this deep sadness in his eyes that only a law student can have. So I was part of the Federalist Society, which for those of you unfamiliar, we're basically a group of legal nerds who love talking about originalism, the non-delegation doctrine, and about why we all hate the modern jurisprudence on the Interstate Commerce Clause. And one of my friends in the Federalist Society is a dude named Kyan, really good guy, really smart guy, and he has this quality that I very much admire in others and I do not possess myself, and that is just an easy self-confidence when he meets new people. And he just got back from the big Federalist Society conference, and he was telling us all about it. And he mentioned that he met a girl there. And he told us the story that he was walking along, and a girl came up and asked him, "Hey, where's the main conference room?" And Kyan thinks, "Oh, she is very into me." So one thing leads to another, and he believes they're dating. And me and the other FedSoc guy was like, well, I don't know, Kyan. Maybe she just wanted to know where the big ballroom was. I mean, I don't know. Just the conference room. Who knows? But little did we know, Kyan was right. He brings out his girlfriend a few months later. We all meet her, and we realize, oh, this is just a perfect couple. They work great together. And we've kept in touch over the years, and that brings us to today's guest. It is that girl who asked Kyan where the main conference room was at the Federalist Society convention, Lexi Hudson, or Alexandra Hudson, as you're known in the public. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's great to be here.
Now, I may have embellished a little over time, but is that roughly how you met your husband, Kyan?
It is. And I think, I can't remember, that we had a very brief conversation. Kyan was working on a paper. I was certain he had this kind of familiarity about it. I mean, I was certain we had maybe met the evening before, and I asked if we had met, and he insisted that we had not, but he thought that was the key. It gave him the additional boost of confidence and that he needed to then kind of initiate a romance. And it was he had been working on a essay on criminal justice reform. I was a student there my final year of undergrad, and you guys were all law students down from Connecticut. And I had been practicing and just kind of keeping up with the news and just doing all sorts of different things to prepare for graduate school interviews and different scholarship interviews that I was applying for. And so I'd very recently memorized Portia's closing monologue from the Merchant of Venice. and so I just happened to drop that just because I happened to have just memorized it. So he was very, very impressed and didn't know that that was not a common thing that I do. But we ended up, of course, staying in touch. And even though I was very focused on grad school and not in a position to want to date, he was very intentional and kind and very interested in my different intellectual pursuits, and he could, talk about faith and books and ideas and history and philosophy and public life. And I loved that he wanted to meet me where I was at intellectually and also theologically, and we shared the same faith perspective as well. And I'd mention a book and he would go read the whole book and then want to come back and talk about it with me, which I just loved. And Friedrich Nietzsche once said that marriage is a long conversation. And I don't think since the day Con and I've met, there's been one day where we haven't talked, where we have not had a conversation. That's certainly been true of our relationship, that just our life of the mind and shared love of beauty and goodness and truth has very much been the lifeline, the bloodline of our of our relationship and our friendship and our love as well. So yes, that fateful day in the Hall of Mirrors at the Mayflower Hotel. Very grateful for to have met him.
Absolutely. Well, I can say I'm very glad that you two have met as well, because you two were both great friends to have in law school. It's been great to keep in touch. And you guys have both gone on to do really, really interesting and impressive things. And it's the things that you were doing that I would like to focus on right now, because I remember a couple years ago, you were in Colorado, so you met up with me and Danielle for dinner, and you're talking about this new writing venture that you wanted to get into. And I remember me and Danielle were driving away from the restaurant like, oh yeah, that's totally going to work. That is right up Lexi's alley. That's going to be great. And you've done a lot of great stuff in there. So let's talk about that first in general. Let's talk about what you're up to, the projects you're working on. What is it you're doing these days?
So I remember that it was almost three and a half years ago now that we met. I had just left my appointment at the U.S. Department of Education, where I served as an aide with Secretary DeVos. And I was kind of very broken at a soulish level and was very disillusioned by the state of American public life and our public discourse. And I had just been very viscerally hurt and wounded and impacted by that, having seen the dysfunction and experienced it up close and personal for a year of my life serving in government. And I knew, I wasn't quite sure how, but I knew I wanted to be a part of the solution. I knew I wanted, whatever God had given me to help heal and just elevate our broken moment in history. And we met when I was on my way to an event with the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute's been a wonderful intellectual home for me. They really care about the life of the mind. They care about ideas. The Aspen Institute was founded in the wake of the U Chicago Mortimer Adler Great Books push in the 1950s, where this was a moment in history where there was just there were door-to-door salesmen selling Sophocles and Homer. and I recently read a biography of this initiative, the Great Books push in the 1950s, 1960s. And it's thought that 1% to 2% of American households had copies of these 100+ great books. And that's just an incredible cultural diffusion of highbrow literature and poetry and philosophy and, ancient science. It's really incredible. And the Aspen Institute is a product of that. And they still very much care about ideas and conversation and the collective pursuit of truth today in their various avenues. And so I remember when I left government, I was just really eager to kind of get back to the ideas, the first principles that had sustained me my entire life. I was raised in a Christian home, and I had the best gift that any child could have asked for in terms of my parents and the education they gave me. They taught me curiosity. They taught me love of learning. They taught me, and they modeled for me both those things, just a passion for a life of the mind and constant disposition of wanting to learn more about the world around us, and how that was like an act of worship, using our creativity, using our minds. That was how we become closest to God. God is creative, and God is the beginning and end of all things and knower of all things. And when we pursue him through our minds and through our pursuits, that we're closest to him. So I'm so grateful for my parents modeling that for me. I went to the Department of Education thinking that there would be people like me there, people who were curious, people who loved ideas, people who loved the life of the mind. And I was disappointed to find that the Department of Education didn't seem to care about education, at least not how I had been educated, which was to love beauty and goodness and truth, and to sustain and nourish curiosity in our life of the mind. And they just seem more concerned concerned with, generating grants and pulling bureaucratic levers than with any of the ideas or thinkers that I cared a lot about. So I left also broken by that, and also by just the lack of common decency in public life. I both witnessed and also endured just some incredibly dehumanizing and cruel and unkind behavior. People that would be very kind and nice and polite to my face would go around and do and say horrible things to me and others, and all doing it with a sweet smile, stabbing while they stabbed us in the back, and I just became really disillusioned by that as well, in addition to the kind of institutional dysfunction. And so my first project that I've been working on since I left the department and since you and I last connected in Colorado is this project on civil discourse, and just trying to think clearly, and also informed by both the human experience and the historical record, thinking deeply about what civility is, why it matters, and why it might be useful to have a little bit more of it in our world today.
Yeah, so much there to pull from that. And first of all, let's just make the point. I love this whole thing about the door-to-door great book salesman. I just picture like this guy in a bowler hat with a big carpet bag in the 50s. Oh,
That's exactly how it was.
Who can write a great play? That's Sophocles. He'll write a play to knock your socks off. I mean, that's amazing.
Right.
I just love that that's reality. It's also a great model for us going forward. It's like, hey, steps to actually get these things into people's hands, get this conversation going. But also, I love I just love the intention and just the purpose behind this, because you have confirmed what many of us have suspected about the federal government and its dysfunction and the soul crushingness of it. But unlike most of us, you decided to try to make a step for good when you got out of that world. So that is so good. I'm so glad that you are doing this. So let's take sort of the first step. And you seem to talk about, like the door-to-door salesman. They seem to believe that there is inherent value in getting these great works by great thinkers of past ages just into the hands of people. What is the value of just having that information out there and dispersed?
Yes, I have lots of thoughts on the Great Books Initiative, both ways to emulate tremendous successes they have, and also ways to remedy some shortcomings as well. And I have lots of thoughts about how to maybe improve on their wonderful project in the future. But in terms of your question about why an education of the great books and great ideas is important in the first place, that's a really important question. No education is complete if someone has not asked and also grappled with and formulated answers for themselves, answers to some of the most foundational and formative questions in life. Questions such as, what does it mean to be human? Why are we here? And what is the best way to live? And far too often in life, people can go through their formal schooling, K to 12, undergraduate degree, maybe even multiple graduate degrees, and they will not have had the opportunity to engage with these questions. And that is a tragedy, and especially not being able to, grapple with those questions for themselves, or grapple with the way in which really thoughtful and wise people in history have answered those questions before us. This is something that I call the great conversation. And this is this iterative dialogue about the highest things, the most important questions in life, that has been ongoing since the dawn of time, and that we have it's a dialogue between very thoughtful and wise people that have come before us, because they were all responding to one another. And it's the conversation and indeed the debate that we can engage in today with the wise people who have come before us. And it's a tragedy to overlook this wealth of human knowledge that is at our disposal. We're in this golden age of information, free or very high quality translations of many of these texts, not to mention the plethora of commentaries and analysis and other just additional supplemental resources to help us engage and understand these ideas. It's just a missed opportunity to try and reinvent the wheel. And like, life is difficult. And there is no question that there are urgent and pressing and important issues in our world today that we need wisdom to deal with them. And why would we unduly cut ourselves off from people who've been thinking about questions of justice and goodness and the best way to do life in our short time here on earth, why would we not want to draw from that fount of human wisdom of people that have come before us? And you hear a lot of people today talk about the Western civilization and, the Western canon. And that's actually not language I like to use, because there is so much wisdom in the broader human experience as well. I'm actually teaching a course right now with my intellectual community, my newsletter platform, my project. It's called Civic Renaissance. It's a weekly newsletter. And this course that I'm teaching is kind of an experiment. It's my first time teaching directly and just studying and reading great texts alongside the people who are kind of part of my newsletter and part of my community. The course is called 5 Classic Books That Will Change Your Life. And we started with Plato's Phaedo, which is about the nature of death and the human soul, which I think is an important place to start, because how we think about death and the nature of what happens to our souls when we die, of course, as Christians, we know this affects how we live our life. And we also know that the church fathers were incredibly influenced by Plato. So it was wonderful to see people read Plato maybe for the first time and be like, you know what, this is very familiar, because our culture is so influenced by just the explicitly Christian view of the soul and the afterlife. But our second text was Confucius's Analects, which I actually read for the first time as part of this course, as part of preparing for this course, and absolutely loved. And it's wonderful to find such resonance in, Platonic theory and Aristotelian theory and Christian virtue in Confucius, this thinker that wasn't familiar with Plato or Aristotle or, Christianity, lived before Christ, but cares deeply about our common humanity, on benevolence, on being good, on our duty to family, our duty to others in our lives. His concept of Ren, Confucius, is incredibly important in Confucius, and it's all about what we owe to one another by virtue of our shared humanity. And in the West, we know that Christianity came along and transformed the secular, pagan, Greco-Roman world and influenced it with, this idea of inherent human dignity, and that it wasn't just Romans and Greeks that were worthy of, citizenship and common rights. All humans were, by virtue of our common humanity. Like, that's a uniquely Christian contribution to the West and to the world we live in today. But it's really wonderful and I think beautiful to find echoes of that in another part of the world, another time, another place, that just reinforces the reality that we have a shared human experience, we have a shared humanity, and that people can come to truth about the human experience by just living life and wanting to live life well and with intention. Like how Confucius talks about wanting to live a life of virtue. Like, there's no other way to live if you're not going to be good to others and fulfill your duty and live a life of loyalty. Like, that could have been written by by Aristotle or Aquinas, and I think it's a missed opportunity to unduly cut ourselves off from the past because we think it's only, old dead white men that that have nothing to say to us today in our heterodox and diverse and multicultural era. Or it's and on the flip side, it's unnecessarily, it cuts ourselves short to not incorporate other aspects of kind of the tradition of human wisdom from other cultures as well, by focusing only on the Western canon too. It's just a wealth of knowledge, a rich tapestry that adds to this great conversation. Again, this iterative dialogue about the human experience that people have been engaging in since the dawn of time, and that we have the chance to engage in too.
Absolutely. And I think there's a couple good points you brought up in regards to sort of the big picture of why the great conversation. I like the way that you frame it as a great conversation, because there's sort of two aspects to it that each make it worthwhile. One, there's the works themselves, the questions they ask, the answers they provide, or the questions they raise in search of those answers. And two, there's just the fact that this is the conversation that we've all been having. Just the fact that by, reading the Iliad, you're not just reading a great work of literature, which you are, but you're also incorporating all the subsequent people, all the other writers, all the other thinkers who have engaged with the subject. And you get to engage with it too. You get to see how they wrestled with it, how this poet wrestled with an aspect of Achilles here, or how this theologian emphasized this other part. Just getting into the conversation is so important in addition to the texts themselves. And I also...
Absolutely right.
Yeah, and I'm almost thinking of this scene in, I forget the author, I forget the name of the book, But the point of the book was to argue the continued significance of Homer. And it was this scene that apparently happened back in Paris back in the day, during the days of Victor Hugo, where some French intellectuals were like, well, Homer's great and all, but Victor Hugo can probably do stuff Homer never could. And the point that the author and the other intellectuals in the book were making was, hey, yeah, Hugo's great, but Homer, it's not just Homer. It's Homer and all the conversation that's gone about him.
Yes.
And yeah, so related to that then is I'm really glad that you also brought up the issue of the quote-unquote Western canon. And I totally agree with you. And especially when we're talking about the big works in other places. I remember reading Confucius and Lao Tzu and all these other thinkers in college and be like, wow, this is really amazing. Like, wait, were they like secretly Christians? I missed this somehow? Like this just seems like so true. And also, this is a nice little coincidence for you, Lexi. On a pretty recent episode, we had Dr. Anika Prather on. And
she's wonderful. I adore Anika.
Isn't she? Yeah. So she talked about the Western canon in the sense that, no, it's not just by a bunch of, dead white guys. The Western canon is multicultural. Other, Africa had a big role in it. Other places did. This belongs to a multicultural people, and it's useful for everyone going forward.
So true. And I mean, next week in the class I'm teaching, 5 classic books that will change your life, we're reading St. Augustine, which I'm sure many of your listeners are at least familiar with or have read, some of his famous works, City of God, or what we're reading in this class is Confessions. And Augustine was from Algeria, North Africa, so very likely had a darker hue of skin. And secondly, he was a Berber. Like, he was on the periphery of society. He was, would have been considered an immigrant and probably, lesser. They were nomadic peoples. And I think that's a really interesting, and he's very much squarely a part of the Western tradition now. And one point that one of my newsletter subscribers raised to me recently about Augustine, because his birthday was just August 28th. And so I put out a little thing about Augustine and also shared content I created at a place Augustine lived in northern Italy that was very formative in his spiritual life. When he was awaiting baptism from St. Ambrose in Milan, he spent time in Casiago Brianza, which is a tiny little town on the tip of the southern end of Lake Como. So it was fun to go there and kind of walk in Augustine's footsteps and reflect on his legacy. But one thing one of my newsletter subscribers mentioned was that maybe it was because Augustine was raised on the periphery of society. He was in the hinterland, not the heartland. That maybe that informed some of his ideas and fresh perspectives that allowed him to influence basically everyone that came after him in the Western tradition and beyond. And so I think that's why, Anika's right that there is so much diversity within the canon as well, that people who are on the inside today were not on the inside during their day. They were either, poor or of a minority background or something like that. It's important to recognize that diversity within the quote unquote Western tradition as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love you bringing that up. And it's just one of those things where it's not a secret that the history of the church is so diverse in that way, but it's something we so conveniently forget. Like St. Augustine was African. St. Athanasius was African. A lot of the early church fathers were African at a time when the Europeans were a bunch of, Germanic barbarians. I mean, this is not something we're making up. This is something that just shows the canon really, really is for everybody.
That's right.
Yes. So let's sort of go forward in these 5 classic books. You talked about Plato, Confucius, St. Augustine. What's the 4th book that of the 5 that you're talking about in your course?
So this past week, just last night, actually, we had a discussion about Cicero's book on friendship, where he takes a lot of, he is obviously very influenced by both Plato and Aristotle on friendship. And Aristotle, for example, says there are 3 common types of friendship. One is friendship of utility, think of a networking lunch where 2 people come together to conduct a business transaction. There are friendships of pleasure. I think this is like a friends with benefits kind of relationship. And then, but Aristotle says those are not true friendships. True friendship are 2 people who care about virtue and are virtuous individuals coming together and forming a relationship. And that's the only true friendship. And that is what anyone and everyone needs to live a meaningful life, to live a life well lived. And so Cicero is very influenced by that and writes this beautiful letter to his best friend Atticus, and it's also in the form of a dialogue of two other famous Roman statesmen who were just kind of a generation before Cicero. And Cicero says that, yes, we need friendship to lead a meaningful life. There are many common barriers to friendship, namely we're self-interested. And when we ask people to do things that are for our benefit, like that's not being a true friend. He says that there's a reason why the root word of friend and love are the same in Latin. The word love is amare. The word friend is amici. Like, you're a lawyer, Matt. Think of an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, right? And he says that's because true friendship is about love. It's about affection. And he says that we need these friendships actually to form broader society. It's this friendship based on virtue at the micro level that builds a virtuous society at a more macro level, which is just so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And so it was wonderful to talk through some of these ideas. Again, this letter written over 2,000 years ago that just seems so timely and relevant and important reminders to us today, especially when our moment in history, we're about a year and a half in to a moment in time where we've been told every day, multiple times a day, that other people are toxic and potentially lethal and potentially our demise. And that is so uncommon, and that's so antithetical to what we know that we need to flourish and thrive in community. We need others. We need friendship. We need relationship to fully flourish. In my book on civility and civil discourse, forthcoming from St. Martin's Press, this is exactly how I characterize what civility is. Civility, I say that, we as human beings, we are defined by two foundational tensions. We are profoundly social. We know that we realize our potential and we become fully human and lead meaningful lives in friendship and in community. Yet we are also deeply self-interested. And our selfishness, this fundamental selfishness, is both biological, we're geared to meet our own needs before others, but also we know moral as well. And these two aspects of our nature are foundational, but also in tension. The social is constantly in tension with the selfish, and is constantly presenting this barrier to us flourishing in social harmony and in community. And that civility is the process by which we overcome the selfish so that that our social can flourish. It's where we deny the self so that we can, for a greater good, for the sake of community and for the sake of friendship. So it was wonderful to unpack, what are the common barriers to friendship today. We talked a lot about technology and just our broader consumerist culture that is constantly feeding our love of the self at every single turn, and that we have to be all the more intentional to rise above that and be other oriented and to be selfless, to deny ourselves that for a greater good, for to really flourish and thrive in community. So that was last night, and last week's book was Cicero on friendship, and then next week we have Augustine.
So Lexi, but before we go on, I do have a question for you.
Yes,
I have a lawyer question. So you mentioned, so for the non-lawyers who are listening, there's a thing called an amicus curiae brief, which means friend of the court in Latin. It's basically when you're not a party, but you want the court to rule a certain way, so you write a fancy brief. There's this huge debate in the legal community. Is it amicus or amicus? So you have a Latin background. Which would you say?
I think at this point we are so disconnected from how Cicero would have pronounced it. I don't think it matters. I think as long as you communicate in a way that people understand. Yeah, maybe I've heard it amici brief. I've heard it amicus brief. I've heard it both ways. So I have a lot of grace. I don't want to be that pedant that corrects someone's Latin and then makes them not want to pursue Latin. I think that don't let the perfect be enemy of the good. Just if people want to, draw a connection between the amicus brief and Cicero, and that draws them to be interested in studying Latin, I want that to happen. I don't want to do or say anything that prohibits that or discourages that.
Okay, Lexi, that was very well played. I asked you a silly question and you flipped that into giving a serious answer with a good point. So well played there. That is a very good point. So just a couple notes on Cicero. I loved, first of all, his reliance on previous philosophers, like his reliance on Aristotle, because that just shows how much of a continuum this is, where it's important to have some familiarity with all the canon because so much of it is interrelated. I was reading, I mentioned this on the last podcast too, but you know what? I don't care because I like N.T. Wright. I was reading N.T. Wright, and he was talking about the Apostle Paul and his use of some form of Aristotelian virtue theory in his ethics. And, N.T. Wright talked about how Paul used it in some ways, sort of inverted some of the thoughts in other ways, and it was very interesting. But it shows, having a basis in Aristotelian ethics, Platonic philosophy, it helps in other areas. It can help you understand the Apostle Paul better, or as with Cicero, it can help you understand modern friendship better. Like these insights you're giving us, Lexi, they work just as well today as they did back in ancient Rome, right?
It's so true. And that's what you get. This is like one of the many benefits that you get from studying these books and studying these thinkers and studying just the ideas and the lives, the biographies of people that have come before us. History is long. Ecclesiastes was right. There is nothing new under the sun. and I think that the best defense against the apocalyptic tenor of our public discourse, that, that every scandal, every crisis is the be all end all, unprecedented, you hear all the time, the world is ending, that actually being grounded in history and having an education in history is a good defense against that. Because you're like, you know what? We've been here before. History is both a caution to us that, we've been here before. We've been at the brink of a crisis of civilization. We've been at war with our, fellow human beings. We've been at the precipice of civilizational collapse. Civilizations have risen and fallen. But it's also comforting as well that, we can learn from the lessons of history and hopefully incorporate those ideas into how we make decisions today. And one last point on Cicero, like you're absolutely right that he was very well versed and uniquely so, actually. The best philosophers of his day, but especially the Greek philosophers that came before him. And Cicero has a really pivotal role in history because he was a translator. He was an interpreter, not just linguistically translating, Aristotle and Plato from Greek to Latin, but also culturally, where he communicated their ideas to his fellow Romans in a way that made it kind of culturally resonant and applicable to their own time. And it is not an exaggeration to say that we know of many Greek philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle, because of Cicero, because he not only, again, translated them literally, but culturally as well. And that is a model in history that I take great inspiration and encouragement from. And that's very much a part of my work, my life's work, and my project of Civic Renaissance, taking the best of the past and deploying it to help us better understand our present and maybe even guide our future in a productive way. It's often quipped that the Romans were not very original, that they just pilfered all Greek literature, philosophy, art, culture, and passed it off as their own. But I would argue that taking the best of the past and melding it with the needs of the present, that's its own act of originality and ingenuity. And that's something that I'm really trying to do with my own work as well. And Cicero is a great model for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we're talking about the best of the past, and we've got a good list going so far of the 5 books in your course. So we have Plato, we have Confucius, we have St. Augustine, and Cicero. Who's number 5 on your list?
Number 5 is probably my favorite thinker and my favorite book of all time, Blaise Pascal's Pensées. Pascal was, he overlapped with René Descartes, kind of the first Enlightenment thinker and famous skeptic, and kind of marks this stark departure from the tradition and cultural dependence on the church and faith, and to an emphasis on reason, science. And Pascal was, in his own right, a brilliant scientific mind. He invented an early prototype of the omnibus system, like the first public transport system in Paris. He coined and discovered and not patented, but developed a metric of measuring called the Pascal. He developed an early prototype of the vacuum and discovered the vacuum. He invented the first computer. Like he invented this calculator that could do kind of simple addition and subtraction. But if you're an accountant during this day, which his father was, it was an enormously helpful invention. Two still exist, one in Paris, one in Germany. I'd love to see it one day. It's called the Pascaline. So he is this incredibly brilliant geometric scientific mind, one of the greatest in human history. And then he has this radical conversion experience where he abandons all of his scientific pursuits and says, like, that was, basically like kind of what Thomas Aquinas said, like, it's all straw. And he locks himself in a room and just thinks about God and the divine and starts writing this book on Christian apologetics, where he wants to just encourage people living a Christian life and living. And he is passionate about the human condition, the greatness and the wretchedness of man that is our existence. And he talked about things that there weren't really words for back then, like anxiety and boredom and despair. And he says, Descartes, you and your faith and reason and science, you are useless and uncertain. And he in a really incredible way anticipates so many of the pathologies and trials of our modern psychological malaise, like the fact that we are anxious and we are encountering many policymakers and people are increasingly concerned about the deaths of despair, related to suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism, and just general loneliness. And, he anticipated all of this and said, the root of man's unhappiness is that we are unable to sit alone in a room by ourselves. Yep. Like, we're perpetually distracted and we need things to just fill our time and fill our minds. And he knew that the heart is restless, as Augustine said, until it finds its rest in Christ. And but there's just something so remarkable and powerful and prescient about Pascal's life story that adds such credibility to his powerful work, his pensées, his scattered thoughts, that he was never able to publish his book. He died an early death because he was, very sick, and also lived this very extreme lifestyle of isolation. And he wore a jacket of nails, where anytime he saw someone, he would jab himself with his jacket of nails. So he didn't enjoy himself too much, which is very extreme, in my opinion. And he sadly died an early death at the age of 39, but he produced not just, incredible scientific achievements, but most importantly, his work of theology, his pensées, his thoughts about the human condition and just the state of mankind apart from God and the hope of mankind in God, in Christ. And so that's a book I'm very excited to walk people through with my course. I'm Christian. My faith informs everything I do, but much of my audience is not. So I really enjoy talking about these seminal works and ideas, powerful ideas about the nature of the human soul and the afterlife and what it means to live a life well lived, knowing that my audience is not primarily Christian, but it's the way to open up people to think about these things and just to provide a venue to think about these very important things, that people of all faith traditions ask these questions and offer answers to these questions.
Yeah, and let me say, I'm so glad you picked Blaise Pascal. He's one of my favorite thinkers as well. And I was very fortunate. My freshman year of college, one of my professors decided to do like a whole section just on the Pensées. So we read through them, discussed them, wrote papers on them. It was so wonderful. And, like most of the stuff you learn in college, kind of filters away as you get older, but some things that you learn stick with you. And one of the things that I learned that stuck with me is exactly what you were saying. Blaise Pascal's thoughts on the greatness and the wretchedness of man, and how so much stems from us not being able to sit in a room by ourselves, and how we have these distractions. In his day it was, playing dice or, going down to the tavern, all this stuff. In our day, I don't even need to say it, it's social media, whatever. And how at the core we want to distract ourselves from our wretchedness, and we can't sit in a room. And I think about this still, and I'll probably be thinking about it for a long time now every time I get on Twitter, because I can't be in a room by myself. I'll just be real. But that just goes to show how Pascal, writing centuries ago, like you said, he had so much insight and could see forward into so many of the things that are plaguing us today. So it really does seem like a common thing with all these thinkers is they all, even though they're a long time ago, they have insights that can still help us today. So I'm guessing when your course title is 5 Great Works That Can Change Your Life, that's the sort of life change you may have in mind?
Absolutely. I think that you can't engage on these topics without having your life changed. You can't think about the nature of death and the human soul and things like friendship and barriers to friendship and loss of friendship. You can't think about, the painfulness of, like, there's a reason that solitary confinement is torture.
Yeah.
People go insane in isolation. Like, Pascal was really onto something when we sit alone with ourselves for too long, but also isolation can be purifying as well. There's a reason that Christ was alone for 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, there's something powerful about isolation too, especially if it's spent in prayer and purification and penance. And so I don't think you can engage with these thinkers and with these ideas thoughtfully and earnestly without coming away changed. I come away changed every single time I engage them. You really can't help it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just so you know, Lexi, I'm sure this will be a huge relief for you. Your 5 books all get the Matt seal of approval. So
excellent. I was worried. Thank you.
There you go. So that's official now. But this current project with your 5 classic books, that is not your only project. We also have something that's been in the works for a bit, and I'm really excited to read this once it comes out. I love the title, Against Politeness. Tell me, why are you so against politeness, Lexi?
So I think that the title will likely change. My book is probably a year out from coming out. But yes, that was a working title for a very long time. The subtitle was Why Politeness Failed America and How Civility Can Save It. And that core idea is still very much part of the project. And that core idea is that there is a fundamental and important and essential difference between civility and politeness. And that too often people conflate the two, whether they are hearkening back and saying, we need more civility and politeness in society, and lamenting that we're in such a uncivil, divided time, or whether they are arguing that civility and politeness are the enemy of social progress and a tool of the white patriarchy, that people on both sides of the question, pro or anti, they do conflate these two terms. And I try to add some conceptual clarity to these ideas. And I do what I often do, turning to etymology as well, looking at the root of these two words to support that. So I say that politeness is a technique. It's superficial. It's manners. It's the protocols and the gestures and it's etiquette. Whereas civility, it goes beyond the superficial, goes on the gestures and the etiquette and the manners alone, and it's a disposition. It's a fundamental orientation of the soul from which actions invariably flow, but it's an orientation, a disposition that sees human beings as people fundamentally like us, beings inherently endowed with dignity and worth and worthy of our respect, and that our actions do flow from that. But sometimes that means being impolite. And sometimes it means breaking the rules of etiquette to actually truly respect someone. For example, in Christian circles, Tim Keller is very famous for saying this, but we're familiar with this concept of speaking the truth in love. That sometimes speaking the truth doesn't seem very polite, but actually speaking the truth and doing it, lovingly and doing it with the best interest of the person at heart, telling someone a hard truth can appear very impolite, but it's often the respectful and loving and kind thing to do. Or think about in the forum of our public discourse that having robust debate and discourse is the lifeline of a democracy and a free society. And we can't be worried about tone and just smoothing over differences. We have to be willing to grapple with important, essential differences and first principles head on. And as I mentioned, I returned to etymology to add more clarity. So the root word of politeness is the Latin poliere, which means to smooth or polish. And that supports the idea that politeness gets to the superficial alone. And that's what politeness does. It smooths over differences and polishes them to make them look better than they actually are. Civility, the root word, is civitas or civis, that the city and relating to citizenship. And that is what civility is. It's conduct befitting a free member of the civis, a member of the civitas, and the conduct befitting a citizen. And that, again, that sometimes requires us departing from whatever the norms of politeness are of the day in the name of a higher good, which is truth-telling, which is freedom, which is, robust debate, free exchange of ideas, again, as the lifeline of a free and flourishing society.
Yeah, and I love that distinction you made. And I think it's so helpful. It'd be so clarifying to so much of just the mess that happens in so many parts of our political discourse now. And based on the way you framed a lot of your arguments there, I'm guessing, to bring this full circle, that in making your argument in your book, you're going to draw a lot on the wisdom of the past. Am I right in assuming that?
You are. It's like I want to deploy the wisdom of the past to kind of bring and kind of embody the sort of education and way of thinking that I plan to make more explicit, that both I believe in, but I plan to make more explicit that argument for why we shouldn't unnecessarily or too swiftly cut ourselves off from these rich sources of wisdom. Those are the topic of books 2 and 3 that maybe we'll have a chance to talk about next time.
Awesome. That is all so great. Like I said, I am really looking forward to your book when it comes out. Just let your editor know if they start getting a bunch of emails from someone just begging them to keep the name Against Politeness as the title. That'll probably be from me, because I think that's a great title.
Thank you.
Lexi, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, joining us here at the Anselm table. Where can we find you? Where can we read your work? Where can we get more of what you're doing?
Please do subscribe to Civic Renaissance, and that's just civic-renaissance.com, and just become a newsletter subscriber. It's a weekly newsletter, and there you get lots of information about things that I'm reading from around the web that engage the great conversation and deploy the wisdom of the past to help us think more clearly about our current problems and live better lives. And also lots of invitations to special events where I engage friends and other people who care about these ideas on important questions. For example, you mentioned Anika Prather, who I just adore. We are having a conversation with her next month in October about how the Mortimer Adler great books push of the Chicago 1950s, 1960s, they didn't have one woman and they did not have one person of color in their canon of 100 books. And actually Mortimer Adler did change his mind. Like in the 90s, they put out a second edition where I think they allowed Virginia Woolf in. But I mean, it's just it's obviously not the case that it's just a missed opportunity. You're cutting yourself off from important contributions to the great conversation to not even take seriously ideas of the many wonderful thinkers, persons of colors and women who have contributed and engaged and benefited from the classical conversation. And then again, doing exactly the kind of thing that we're doing, like deploy the ideas, help think more clearly about justice and the good today. Dr. Martin Luther King is a wonderful example. Like he mentioned Socrates 3 times in his letter from Birmingham jail. He invokes Augustine. He invokes Aquinas. Augustine, he says, I would agree with Augustine, an unjust law is no law at all in his letter. It's an important reminder that these ideas, these thinkers can help us. They can be tools of justice and creating a better world and future. But anyway, that's a conversation happening next month about what would we, if we were to open up the core again, and if we were to hypothetically undertake this project again of just who are the thinkers that everyone should read? Who would we include that was not included in this original project? And so that'll be a really fun conversation. And yes, but please subscribe to Civic Renaissance. Would love to have you as part of the community and to stay engaged.
Absolutely. That sounds amazing. Please tell Dr. Prather hello from all of us over at Anselm. And Lexi, thank you once again. Really appreciate your time. And people, seriously, check out Civic Renaissance. Lots of great stuff there. And don't worry, listeners, when her book is out, I'll probably let you all know. So Lexi, thank you once again.
Thank you.
All right. Well, things are winding down at the Anselm Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers. The customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Thank you all again, and we will see you next time.